Welcome to this much anticipated Space News Forum on the race to the moon. I'm David Ariosto, and thank you all for joining us here and this, well, essentially joining this truly global convening of experts and industry leaders and space competitors from around the world. This is really sort of a truly international forum that we have here, which is great. I'll give you a quick little introduction, and they'll just jump right into it. From Washington, D.C., we have the pleasure of having Mike Gold join us. Mike is the Chief Growth Officer at Redwire. He's responsible for civil, commercial, national security business, but he's got some serious NASA chops as well, Associate Administrator for Space Policy and Partnerships. And what I'm quite interested in is he helped author and lead the Artemis Accords. So we're happy to have you, Mike. From across the world, literally on the other side of the world, from Beijing, we have Ya Song, who's the co-CEO and co-founder of Orienspace, which, as many of you know, produces China's most powerful commercial rocket. He previously founded DeFi Tech in Beijing, which basically focused on using deep learning technologies to increase the processing speed of drones and robots and data centers and surveillance technologies. So certainly a lot of interest in you, Song, today. Certainly a lot of people that likely have some questions in terms of the nature of development of Orienspace and your background. We also have Dr. Namrata Goswami. She's joining us from Montgomery, Alabama, and she spent nearly a decade at the Institute for Defense Studies Analysis in New Delhi. She's the author of a truly fantastic book. So if you haven't seen this, you should check it out. It's called Scramble for the Skies. She teaches space policy at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona State. Going back now to Europe here, I feel like I'm ping-ponging around the globe a little bit here, but is a former Brigadier General and former Director of NASA Ames Research Center, Pete Worden, who now is not only helming a lot of different interstellar initiatives, which we'll talk about, at least in the context of the moon being a bit of a springboard, at least in the immediate solar system, but also sort of more deep space questions. But he also advises Luxembourg Space Agency on its space efforts, and that's where he's joining us from now. And last but certainly not least is Blaine Curcio, who's the founder of Orbital Gateway Consulting, who is really widely considered a leading Chinese space industry analyst, and he was based in Shenzhen and Hong Kong for many years. So thank you, all of you, for attending. This is going to be a really exciting panel. There's been a lot of news that has centered around the moon recently, just recently with the Chang'e 6 mission, returning lunar samples from the far side of the moon. Not to mention the Intuitive Machines commercial landing back in February. So, we have a lot to kind of dig into this conversation with the truly esteemed panel. For you in the audience, thanks again for joining us. I'll kind of give you a little bit of a breakdown how this is going to work. This is going to be an hour-long forum. I will moderate it for about 45 to 50 minutes. I'm going to encourage crosstalk, some conversations, so that I'm not sort of the sole arbiter here, despite the formal attire that I'm wearing here. I'm trying to keep this somewhat conversational and informal. But at the end, you're going to have an opportunity to ask some questions. So if you can put your questions in the chat box, that'd be really helpful. Don't wait till the end, however. Put those questions in the chat box as we go. Right around the 40-minute mark, we'll cut off those questions. And one of my colleagues, Dan Robitzski, will essentially consolidate those, send them over to me, and we'll get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. So that's it. That's sort of like the lay of the land here in terms of how we're going to be doing this. Just as a primer to kind of get into this, this is a space news conversation about the race to the moon. There's some debate out there whether the word race is even the right word. Races usually end. This one certainly has potential to endure, but there's no denying that there is indeed competition for the lunar surface, development of the cislunar economy, potential lunar economy, and that competition is indeed part of this remarkable shift that includes just a host of new players, both globally, internationally, but also in the private sector. So it's a very different era than those old Apollo and Soyuz days. And I kind of wanted to get right into it with Mike, who, you worked in the belly of the beast at NASA there, and you helped author and lead the Artemis Accords, and which is this multinational approach to developing, a permanent presence in deep space, really starting with the moon. So I was hoping to kick this off. You can kind of just set the table for us. Where are we now? Artemis 1 has long since launched, but what's it look like from here as we're starting to go forward in this push with Artemis, but also in this broader competition that we all find ourselves in?
Yeah, thanks, David, and appreciate Space News sponsoring this event. Perhaps before I talk about where we are now and where we're going, I think it is important to look back on where we were, and particularly at NASA, when it came to beyond LEO human spaceflight, we have been unable to sustain a program since Apollo. One could say that when it came to beyond LEO human spaceflight, failure wasn't just an option, it was a certainty. And that's why with Artemis, it's been so important to learn from the mistakes of the past and understand what we need to do to be successful, what we need to do to be sustainable. And back when I was at NASA in coordination with former Administrator Jim Bridenstine, we really thought that there were two issues that we need to tackle in order to have a sustainable, successful program. One was bipartisanship, that it can't belong to any one party, that we need a program that enjoys robust support on Capitol Hill. And that's why I think it was so important, the political background that Jim had and that Senator Nelson has. There was a question as to whether a politician should ever leave NASA. Now I'm convinced that probably only politicians should lead NASA, that it's a very important piece of the toolbox, or at least among senior NASA leadership, there needs to be someone with close ties to Capitol Hill as well as the administration. And I think that's why Senator Nelson and Jim Bridenstine were so successful. But the second part of the equation was international, particularly if you contrast our beyond LEO human spaceflight efforts to what's occurred in LEO, where the International Space Station has been a foundation, a bedrock of human spaceflight, been very successful over decades. Look at what the first word in the name is. It's international. So we knew for Artemis to be successful, it had to be global. And I'm very proud that through the Artemis Accords, through the Artemis program, we have built the broadest, most diverse global human spaceflight coalition in history. And I think that's at the heart of not only making a program sustainable and successful, but what makes space so special, that it can bring us all together as humanity, especially at a time where there's so much conflict. Space just proves that there is common ground, we can work together. And yes, it's a race, and yes, it's a competition, but it can also bind us together in ways that really no other field of endeavor can. So as we look ahead, the race to the moon and the development of the moon will be far more global than anything that has happened before. It's also going to be far more focused on permanence. As you look at the gateway, and at Redwire, we're very proud to be building right now the rollout solar arrays for the gateway that I believe will be the largest solar arrays ever deployed by humanity. Our Belgian office is working on the international berthing and docking mechanism that will literally unite the gateway. I'd like to say congratulations to our friends at United Arab Emirates, who recently committed to providing the airlock for Gateway. So here you see this global coalition forming, and that is an indication of what the future is going to be. Whereas Apollo was two countries really competing, this is now a global exercise, and I believe that's all for the better. And the private sector is going to play a much broader role. That you hear just in terms of what we're doing at Redwire, of course, there's SpaceX, Blue Origin, the private sector, and the opportunities for growth, for innovation, for creativity is like nothing that's ever occurred before. Apollo was, I'm sure, very exciting, but if I were to sum up Artemis in the future in one word, it would be diversity. Diversity of companies. We've never had these corporate opportunities, these public-private partnerships before. Diversity of countries that I mentioned. and diversity of people as well, that I believe this astronaut corps is the most diverse in history. And looking ahead, it's infrastructure, again, gateway, that we're going not just back to the moon, but to stay. Even just a decade ago, we thought the moon was bone dry. Now we know that there's water ice that could not only enable the future on the moon, but going to Mars. And you mentioned up front that this is a race that won't end. And I'll just end by saying that the moon is a launching point. The moon is a beginning, not an ending, towards exploration, and particularly as we go on to Mars and the rest of the solar system. So I've never been more optimistic, more excited about this diverse global effort to take humanity to the stars.
Mike, that's great. And I want to go on to Yao Song right at this, but I do want to have a quick follow-up with you, Mike. You mentioned the Apollo program, and obviously the commentary during the 1960s was about the race, right? The falling behind. Are we falling behind the Soviets? The Soviets ahead of the Americans in that context. Is there that same sense within NASA and sort of within the broader landscape, both in the public and private sector, particularly when you sort of look at a program like Artemis for as wide of a multinational push as it is, nonetheless has missed some deadlines, and you look at the Chinese counterparts, and certainly what the Indian Space Agency is doing, and others, and there's this question now about whether there will be a ceding of what has been sort of a long-established lead.
Mm-hmm. So I think that competition can be a very healthy thing, a good thing. Well, you mentioned that we're behind schedule. I mean, welcome to the aerospace industry. It's a fair shock, but I do think that we're making good progress, at least in a relative sense, to a program of this complexity, of this ambition. Again, we are literally at Redwire and beyond NASA building the gateway, and particularly the power and propulsion element, the first element of gateway, as we speak, launching in the not too distant future. India, again, has had tremendous success at a very affordable and low cost with, Chandrayaan, that moon mission, as well as the private sector. Again, we're not just trying to create better technology, but a new paradigm with these public-private partnerships. And of course, our friends in China has had success with the lunar sample return, adding to the global knowledge in terms of what's occurring. Relative to the competition, I do want to say that it's important that we not just take our astronauts and our technology to the moon, but our values as well. And I think it's very important for America to try and be first, and that the countries that are the first are going to set the rules, the norms of behavior. And this is where, again, the Artemis Accords were so important, that we want to create a future of peace, of prosperity, of transparency, of interoperability. And while I think it's, again, very important that we be first, there is a great opportunity, I believe, particularly in space law and policy, to cooperate with China, to cooperate with the ILRS countries, to find common ground. We're all signatories to the Outer Space Treaty. I think we can all find ways to coordinate. There was a singular event at the United Nations where we all came together to identify that common ground. So yes, there's competition, but I think there's also opportunities for cooperation, maybe even a lunar sample swap, relative to what just occurred. So I think there's no simple answers. I'm an attorney, so of course I'm going to say the answer is both.
Right. All right, great. Song, I want to move on to you. Now, I want to make clear that we're not looking at you as a representative of Chinese space policy here. You're running a private company. However, you are a commercial representative, and you've had some great success with the Galaxy launch vehicles, even just recently. But in our conversations, you have said that you're positioning your company in terms of a potential competitor to SpaceX with regard to the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy. And while your competition and while your market is certainly more satellite oriented now, if I sort of look at the landscape, the Falcon 9 is what took the Nova Sea lander to the lunar surface just back in February here. Um,
Uh-huh.
so, you know, I guess for starters, that's a good place to start. So where would you say your company fits into this broader competition?
I see. Uh, First of all, it's my great pleasure to join this webinar. So it has been, I think, 4 years that I did not join an English webinar. So as the commercial space industry in China somehow is so mysterious for you. So maybe can have a very short a brief introduction to myself and also my company or the industry in China. Maybe I can have 1 more minute
Sure,
for
sure,
this.
sure, please.
So I graduated actually from the Department of Double E in Tsinghua University, and I was a visiting researcher in Stanford University in 2014. And my first startup called DeFi company focused on AI chip acquired by Xilinx, the FPGA company, in 2018. So I worked in Xilinx for 3 years during 2018 to 2021. After that, I started this company called Orienspace, to build commercial rockets, to launch satellites into the orbit. So we launched our first rocket called Gravity One. It's the largest pure solid state rocket in the world. So we have successfully launched 3 remote sensing satellites to the orbit this January. So, speaking of the competition or the broader landscape or say the roadmap for our company, right? So first of all, I think there will be so many corporations between United States and China and between China and the other countries. Because you can see, go back to 1960s when running the Apollo project, you can see United States government, I think, spent more than 3% of federal budget on Apollo project. But for now, you can see for Artemis, I think it's about $2 billion or $4 billion, not that much. So space exploration is extremely expensive. So I think global corporation can help to, to help this moon exploration become more affordable. Besides for our company, so we have a plan of 3 different rockets, Gravity 1, Gravity 2, and 3. For Gravity 1, it's a pure solid state rocket because the manufacture process of solid rocket engine is quite mature in China. So we can build our rocket, I think, in 3.5 years. And the ratio of the ratio of successful launch is, I think, over 90%. So our first rocket uses solid state engine. But for the next one, Gravity 2, just like the famous Canlon 3, which recently resulted in a mistake in accident, it's actually something similar to Falcon 9. So it has also 9 engines, and the thrust of each engine is about 85 tons. So the payload of that rocket is about 15 tons to 500 kilometer SSO orbit.
You
And
know,
the next,
I do want to ask you about that. And this obviously wasn't your company, but you mentioned earlier at one point that the regulatory environment is very different in China in the commercial space with regard to,
yeah,
to the
yeah.
regulatory environment in the United States, at least in terms of when you start a company.
Mhm.
I wonder if you can just kind of like give us a little bit of insight in terms of, because there's an expectation that a lot of the bigger, particularly lunar programs are going to be state oriented within China. However, increased development in the commercial sector, I imagine, will ultimately play some role in this, particularly if you're talking about a rival to SpaceX. So
Sure.
walk me through that regulatory environment. It's because you had a foot in the United States, having studied at Stanford, and you developed companies in Beijing. How
Mhm.
are they different?
Yeah, I think the environment, not just for the regulation part, but also for the commercial part, is quite different between United States and China. I think maybe I can, maybe 3 major differences. First of all, I think in United States, you have set some laws first. For example, back to 1980s, I think there are some new laws about commercial space area. So there are several laws in 1980s, 1990s, and during maybe Clinton or Obama period. So, but in China, you can see for just like in internet area, so Chinese government allows you to anything you want. But if you made some mistake, like accident, then they will consider and make a law. Then after that, so law first or law after some, process after several years. I think the first major difference.
Right.
Besides, you can see for now the lunar exploration or lunar, landing on the moon or sending astronauts to the moon is majorly done by the national team. But for now, you can see in the United States, NASA do not build rockets themselves, but Boeing, Lockheed Martin, or Blue Origin or SpaceX will build all these rockets and spaceships.
Yeah.
Besides, I think last but least, I think the environment in China is quite different because you can see in Florida, in Texas, near Houston, you can find a lot of large areas, just like desert near the sea. So you can build a lot of launch bases. But for China, you can see in the east part of China, Shenzhen, Shanghai, near the coast are really good large cities. So you can see there are people around China. So if you want to build,
and we've seen some of the damage of that recently.
Yeah, if you want to build all these rockets near some industrial park, so there will be a lot of people. So it's not just like United States, right? You have a lot of land near the coast, but without people in there.
Right.
So quite different.
And for the Galaxy One, just the last pump, and then I want to kind of move on here. One of the other points, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this, was that you weren't actually in the mission control for the Galaxy One launch. There's a certain handing over to the state at some point during the management of some of these operations.
Yeah. Yep. So I think in this August there will be first launch in Hainan International Commercial Launch Base. So before that, actually, you can see for all these commercial launches, the military will worry about whether it will fail, right? Where they will fall into some, residential area. So we build all this rocket, but finally to ignite the engine, the button is, finally pressed by the military.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. I want to move on to Namrata. Namrata, you recently wrote about the Chang'e 6 moon mission, and you called this a game changer in terms of its ability to not only land there but return lunar samples. And from a geopolitical perspective, and if you want to expand upon that, certainly, but why? Why is this such a game changer in terms of this most recent mission?
Yeah, sure, David. And first of all, thank you for having me, and really interested and enjoyed listening to my panelists before. So when I actually wrote that piece, that continued with a lot of research I've done for several years now on China's space program. So there are three reasons why I think the Chang'e 6 is a game changer. One is that it is occurring within a shift in narrative when it comes to going to the moon. So earlier, and even now, if you look at the US space program, there is a lot of focus on it being about science and exploration. And while permanent presence is talked about, it's still within a very tight narrative of this being all about science, right? And so this is why Chang'e 6 is a game changer, because the designers of the Chang'e 6 very clearly points out that the Chang'e 6 mission is a continuation of China's ability to do in situ resource utilization, as well as the utilization of the lunar resources for building the permanent capability they want to build by 2036. So that's why it's a game changer. It's a shift of narrative from the Cold War to a post-Cold War world where nations are starting to view the moon as a strategic asset. Now, so that is the second reason why it's a game changer. The second reason is that if you listen to the narrative coming out of China, including how President Xi responded to the success, the Chinese narrative and very largely the Indian narrative today, including from the Indian Space Research Organization chairperson, is that the moon is a strategic asset. for these countries. So they view it as a nationalistic strategic asset. And based on that narrative, every other conversation around competition and cooperation is happening. So that's the second reason. The final reason is that this is the first time that a nation has actually landed on the South Pole and has been able to successfully bring back samples, which means the kind of analysis that they're going to do, in fact, there is extensive assessment of what the samples will actually reveal about the moon's South Pole in Chinese media. And if the audience is interested, they can have a look. So the basic argument is that besides just understanding how that particular area of the moon is formed, what do we understand about the origins of Earth, there's a lot of focus on how these resources can reveal what elemental composition is there on the moon, because the entire program from a geopolitical perspective is about in situ resource utilization. And I'll finally end by saying that this is actually game-changing at the geopolitical and international level, right? So there is a tendency to talk about space as if it's a dimension or a domain out there that is not connected to anything else. Whereas if you listen to the narrative of those involved in the space programs around the world, and I'm talking about not just the US, China, India, Russia, but 76 nations today, they view space as a part of their larger sense of who they are as nations, the identity, the location, the implication of space as a multi-domain capability building. And so the moon is now within that particular narrative. So, so what you see in this phase of exploration of the moon is that there are three very interesting formations happening. One is, of course, the major powers that are actually showcasing technology and ability to get there. China, India, the US, Russia to an extent. And then you have the middle powers, countries like Luxembourg, where Pete is talking from, and the United Arab Emirates, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, very interestingly now talking about how they can form the more normative structure. And then finally, of emerging nations in Africa, Latin America, that are starting to think about who do you actually collaborate with in this particular structure of the race to the moon. So that's what I would say is happening in the context of today.
You know, that leads me perfectly into sort of the next transition to Blaine. And Pete, we're gonna give you a chance to sort of summarize a lot of this in terms of what the springboard sort of looks like, and when we talk about deeper space. But Blaine, I mean, you've talked about in the past that as this international competition grows, you might start to see some of these smaller and mid-level nations ultimately pairing off and have to join these blocks of larger players. And I'm really wondering what that looks like. You know, what are the significant or what are the significations of or the significant factors that play into that decision? And those who sign on to Artemis, or those who sign on to the International Lunar Gateway Station that's led by the Chinese, partly the Russians, and then there's some other groups in there, Venezuela, South Africa. But you know, are these things mutually exclusive, or do you see this as sort of a bifurcation in terms of the associations that groups and blocks of nations are now pairing off into these very, very different organizations that have potentially different value structures, certainly similar aspirations strategically, but different ways of approaching that. So what does that look like? What are the implications of this pairing off?
Sure. So I guess just to the first part of your question as to whether they're mutually exclusive, or I guess yeah. I think up to this point it's not. There's no official document anywhere that says if you join Artemis you cannot join ILRS or vice versa. And to now, in particular on the Chinese side, I think there has been a little bit more of an emphasis on what we could call low-hanging fruit. I mean, most of the nation states or entities that have signed on to ILRS are kind of usual suspects, countries like Pakistan or Egypt or Russia. So I think what'll be interesting to see moving forward is some of these middle powers that Namrata referenced. Indonesia, for example, a large enough country to be able to have a bit more, let's say, heft on its own, where it could say to both sides, I want to be involved in both of these programs for different reasons, for my own country's scientific research or this type of thing. But I think just generally speaking, there's not any mutual exclusivity or any kind of that up to now officially. And then I think when looking at why countries would join either ILRS or Artemis, I think a couple of considerations. I mean, there's clearly the political consideration of just, is the country more generally kind of on the pro-China Russia side, and there's a handful of such usual suspect countries, some of which I just mentioned. But then also, you have countries that are obviously on the other side, like Australia or various European countries that were, again, pretty low-hanging fruit on the U.S. Artemis side. And then the other consideration probably would be, just scientific research and development. So certain countries are probably going to have certain priorities in their own space sector development, and those priorities may align better with what China and Russia are doing with ILRS, or with what the US and its allies are doing with Artemis, let's say. So, if a country's, like Canada, for example, doing the Canadarm and really focusing on developing a space robotics sector, presumably there would be similar robotic type of technology involved in Artemis and with the Gateway and all of that. And so it would just make more strategic sense for the development of their space industry to go with that program, even if it wasn't already, a very fairly easy choice given the lengthy border between the two countries. But digressing, that would be another consideration for sure in terms of which side countries would pick. But it's not yet clear that it's a forced choice, let's say.
Mike, you look like you're ready to chime in here any moment here. So you seem like you want to address this, particularly on the international partnerships and cooperation portion.
Forgive me, I just got that face, I guess, that looks like I can jump in. But I will say the Artemis Accords were designed, and the Artemis program, that no matter how wealthy your country might be, or how accomplished in space, or how modest or how new a country is to space, that there's a seat for you at the table, that there's a way to participate. And Blaine references, the low-hanging fruit. Even among the initial signatories to the Accords, there was an intentional effort to broaden the partnership. So, for example, Luxembourg, where PETA's right now was at. United Arab Emirates was a founding member of the Artemis Accords. So even early on, the idea was to broaden. And then there have now been 43 countries that have signed the Accords. And while there is a difference between signing the Accords and joining the program, certainly it's an indication of interest in Artemis and a commitment to a peaceful and prosperous future in space. And while I'm thrilled to have countries like France, Canada, Japan, traditional allies, what gets me equally, if not more excited, is Peru, Bahrain, Armenia, these countries that are taking their first bold steps into space that may not even have a space agency, and how we are taking the advantages, the benefits, the science of space global, bringing it to places where they haven't been. And to the extent that that's an indication of what this new era is, it's extraordinarily exciting. And that is becoming a more significant number of the Accords family of nations, with 43 growing. I think we'll have more than 50 moving forward. So I think, again, the diversity and the breadth has been wonderful, and has basically been proven with the 43 nations as we look at everything from traditional states that have participated in space exploration to powerful and capable entrants that don't quite have the track record, like Brazil. United Arab Emirates is doing wonderful things, and then the new entrants as well. So I think just in Artemis, there's a very broad coalition that's already been assembled, and it's only going to grow in the future.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is something that I've kind of struggled with a little bit in terms of trying to kind of piece this together. And Namrata, that you might be able to answer this, or Pete, you might be able to. But in the broader context of collaboration in space, this has always kind of seemed like a bit of an exception. It's almost kind of like working in the Arctic. Like, conditions are so foreboding that it just sort of behooves us to work together. And we saw that with Soviet and U.S. collaboration during the Cold War, and to some extent that still exists now aboard the ISS, and certainly with the resending of astronauts from the Cosmodrome, the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. That's different now to a large extent because of the Wolf Amendment. And there's the clear dividing lines here. And I wonder why in that context. I mean, the official reason obviously is it was, I believe it was based on, you know, concerns of human rights abuses amongst Uyghur populations that sort of brought about this amendment. But it sort of manifested and changed since then. I open that up to anyone who wants to take it. I mean, Namrata, you're shaking your head right now, but I put that out there.
Well, yeah, so yes, the Wolf Amendment, of course, for your audience, is something that does not allow NASA or the Office of Science and Technology within the White House. There's a misunderstanding that it stops every US entity from collaborating, which is not correct. So it's just two entities. But then to answer your question, that does create a larger constraining narrative and structure. So I would say that one reason why, as you know, the Wolf Amendments also, not just human rights, but also the fear of intellectual property theft in terms of what at that time was considered China's nascent space capability. The second thing, which actually continues to be a concern even today, is that if you look at the Chinese ecosystem, and this is something I would like to mention, that one thing during the post-Cold War period that I'm observing is that nations are very quickly changing their institutional structures as to how they want to deal with space. So India completely reorganized its institutional structure. The Indian Space Research Organization is not going to be the manufacturing hub. They will just do research and development, the commercial sector. We heard from our colleague from China how commercial space is being pushed in China. So within that context, I think the one concern that still remains for US-China collaboration between NASA and the Office of Science and Technology and Chinese Space Institution is that China has not done a very good job of ensuring that their space program is completely bifurcated, which means that civil, military, commercial is not integrated. In the US, you have a strategic integration, but institutionally they're separate. Whereas in China, that particular capability to do so is not yet clear. And I'll finally end by saying that people keep talking about how the Soviet Union and the US were able to collaborate, but also forget that there was a international relations conceptualization called détente, where there was an overall understanding that US-Soviet Union will come together. And then the leader in power at that time in Russia was Boris Yeltsin. So it's very important to remember when we think about collaboration as to what is the leadership structure, who do you want to collaborate with, what particular missions and activities do you want to collaborate with? So all these still continues to be concerned. And while there are now arguments that because China is achieving so much, that we need to have a better collaborative structure with them, those concerns still remain in my mind.
Pete, I want to ask you to this question, and then Song, I want you to have a chance to respond to that. But Pete, if you have a really unique perspective in all of this, in the context that you bring both military and a NASA perspective, and you have you're certainly of a global perspective in terms of your work now with Luxembourg, and certainly you are known for someone who's just pushing the bounds of what is possible, given your work with some of these interstellar initiatives. So I think it's a two-part question, but at first I was hoping that you might be able to respond to what Namrata just said, and then we can kind of relate it back a little bit more to the moon as that springboard and why it's strategically important, if it is, these notions of a potential gas station for the rest of the solar system, or if there's something else at play here.
Well, I kind of have gone back and forth in my career on the importance of the moon, or and of course it's a long-standing argument of moon versus Mars. When given a choice, the best answer is to choose both. But I think we're really at the verge of our civilization. I don't know, I want to say species, I'll say civilization, expanding into the solar system and potentially beyond. And the moon is not only the first step, it's, I think, the enabling capability there. And it is important that we figure out ways to do this, because the politics of today aren't the politics of 20 years ago, and they certainly won't be the politics of 20 years from now. And that how to work through that. You know, and I think one of the big questions is, you know, why is the moon important? Do we even need it? And that was a major question when I persuaded the deputy prime minister of Luxembourg 15 years ago to start the initiative. Their Luxembourg Space Agency Space Resources Initiative, and they did a number of value propositions, and it's the key thing was that the moon is potentially, in fact, more than potentially, it's clearly a source of propellant. And I mean, I've heard this from, you know, lots of different people. You can argue about when and how much, but you know, the gravity well is much less deep than the Earth's gravity well. Bringing fuel from the lunar surface is probably in the form of volatiles and hydrogen and oxygen. I think is a big important effort, but this goes far beyond this. I think you know, in some sense, the moon provides resources to solve problems on Earth. One of the things that I'm probably going to get in trouble for pushing it, but in the last few decades, there's been a concept called solar geoengineering, which is you can solve climate change by blocking sunlight. Now, the simplest way is you put dirt in the Earth's atmosphere. That has its downsides. But there's a more dramatic way that you put sunglasses on the Earth. You can use lunar resources to reflect 1% or 2% of sunlight. This is a major project, to be sure, but the moon is a clearly an effort as an approach for that. Several other things that are really important. And this is one I think that really is a question for the commercial people, and it'd be my question for everybody. The moon is a unique place, particularly the far side, for radio astronomy. We're already seeing that you know that the skies are being whitened, you know, over the planet, which ruins optical astronomy. But those satellites also emit in radio. One of the things that my foundation does is we look for alien signals, and that's called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence or Techno Signatures. The far side of the moon is currently the only quiet place that we know of, really, in the solar system that's blocked from the Earth. We're concerned about the increasing placement of the scientific community is about satellites, and this could answer some fundamental questions. Are we alone? It also is a window into the earliest, it's called the dark ages of the universe. So I think scientifically the moon is something that we can really work all together. And finally, of course, in my own personal interest, you know, we're thinking about how do you go interstellar, which, you know, I think this solar system is boring. And there's, as far as we know, no exciting aliens, but they might be in nearby star systems. That there was a laser-driven light sails, and the optimal place to put a laser is building them, and these are hundreds of gigawatts or even bigger, on the far side of the moon. That has the advantage of not threatening anything on the Earth. So I think it's probably the key to the solar system, and in terms of fuel for Mars and beyond. I think it's the key to climate change. I think it's the key to answering fundamental scientific questions. And finally, it's the key to going interstellar. Other than that, it's probably not very important.
You know, all of you sort of watching at home and on this panel may have wondered why I went to Pete last in terms of this this discussion about sunglasses on the moon and search for aliens, and that might have been part of it. But you know, I always enjoy our conversations, Pete. You mentioned radio astronomy on the far side of the moon, and that actually is kind of a good segue in the sense that there has been collaboration there. I mean, we saw during the Chang'e 3 mission, there was, you know, the first radio telescope that was, or a spectrometer. It was a spectrometer. It was an ultraviolet telescope that was put on. And I think that was the first time since John Young and Charlie Duke did it, you know, years and years ago during the Apollo program. So, like, there is this sense of collaboration in some respects with regard to the scientific community. But I wonder from your perspective, Song, Getting back to that sense of not only collaboration, but things like the Wolf Amendment, how has that impacted you in your company, both in terms of supply chains and the things that you need to do to sort of make your company run?
You mean specifically for the moon lunar exploration, or just
Not necessarily, but just in the broader context of your day-to-day operations and your ambitions, both in terms of becoming a Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rival and the day-to-day.
Yeah. So first of all, for my short-term goal, I think by 2030s, we want to build our Falcon Gravity 3, which is similar to Heavy Falcon, which can send over 50 tons of payload to 500 kilometer SSL orbit. So that Gravity 3 is able to send, I think, over 10 tons of payloads to the moon. So maybe at that time, we can consider send some payloads, some landers to the moon. So I think in this April, I host Mr. Steve Durst, from the International Lunar Observation Association. So that is in our consideration. Besides, I think in near term, maybe in 3 or 5 years, we will focus on only Chinese market, because there is the national satellite international project, and also some local project from Shanghai, also some private satellite internet companies called Galaxy Space, and they just launched their service in Thailand. I think just 3 weeks ago, and I also went to Bangkok at the ceremony. So recently we are just to aim to reduce the cost. I think for China, it's called the world's factory, because we manufacture everything, and the cost of all the schools are quite low in China. So the goal by 2030, I think, to reduce the launch cost similar to reusable Falcon 9, or even lower than a reusable Falcon 9, or even lower the Starship. Maybe this is our recent goal. Speaking of this supply chain, I think due to some regulations, and also due to some ITAR and some other things, so far we are 100% supply chain are just in China, and I think half by half. Half is from the national institutes and half from the commercial companies. Yeah, and we are also building some new things. For example, for national teams, for national missions, actually, safety, the success is the most important thing. So they will just use space-grade devices in all these rockets and also satellites. But for our commercial missions, actually, we can endure some ratio of failure, for example, 1% or 2%. In this way, we're just exploring how to use, industrial grade high performance computing onto rockets, and also, so the Ether network for cars, for vehicles, also onto our rockets. So we're doing a lot of different tests of industrial devices and technologies to do that on our rockets.
Right. One more kind of question, and actually just a point of distinction is something I wanted to raise. I think, for maybe the broader sort of layman audience, you think about the moon, and you think about its geostrategic location is I don't want to say it's obvious, but it's right there. We look at it, right, and there's questions surrounding growth and infrastructure as it relates to how the commercial sector and the public sector will interact. But I think there is also a sense, or maybe a lack of awareness in some ways, about why specific locations on the moon matter more than others. And if you look at the sort of the lunar South Pole, if you look at the far side, if you even look at specific locations like Mount Massive, that get that 90% sun, for solar recharging purposes, the real estate starts to shrink. Right, so you have this massive celestial body that we all look up at, but then the places that are the true prime real estate areas for strategic interest get smaller and smaller, and we even saw overlapping landing zones with the Intuitive Machines lander and with regard to some of the Cheng programs. So I wonder, in the context of resource development and strategic imperatives, this might be a question that you can answer, Pete. If not, then I can open it up broader to the group.
Well, to be sure, it's just like on the Earth. I mean, if you're looking for gold mines, there's only a few places that have a lot of gold, and clearly, I think this is where protocols are needed. That when there's limited resources, and I think this is an imperative fairly soon. I mean, the thing I mentioned about protecting lunar far side for science is another protocol that's needed. So I think there's fairly urgent discussions that are needed with, sort of globally. As you said, there are a lot of new spacefaring groups that aren't the traditional ones. And it's, so this is really an appeal. I mean, there's various groups that are sort of thinking about it. And there will probably be other places as well. I mean, my own favorite location on the moon that we haven't really investigated very much are uncollapsed lava tubes, at which we know there are a few, because those are places for human habitation. So I think there needs to be a survey figuring out, what these resources are, and there'll be new ones that'll come up over time. Yep. There's unobtainium that you can mine at certain locations that is going to be valuable, but I think this is something, and it, the model for this that I'm very interested in is the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, that has handled geosynchronous admirably with and frequency allocations. It started out, I think, in 1865 as the International Telegraphic Union, and it includes not only governments but it includes private sector and commercial aspects. So I'm anxious that we do something about that, and it could probably be done initially without much government, but I think we need those protocols. They're really urgent.
Great. It's about 10 to the hour now, so I'm gonna go to some of the audience questions. This one is from Chris Davenport of the Washington Post. It really had to go back to sort of this question of a race. What are the ramifications if China sends humans to the moon before the U.S. can return astronauts there? Is it sort of simply a matter of national prestige, or are there broader consequences relating to discovery, setting of norms of behavior, military strategy? And then obviously this is taken in the context of the first space race, frankly, back in 1969. So this, I mean, I'd love to pitch this to you, Mike, in terms of its potential ramifications, and what we're looking at here. What are the stakes essentially involved? I think that's really the essence of the question.
Yeah, and let me go back to what Pete was saying, and when he raised about the limited areas on the moon, that there's only going to be so many regions that have access to water ice, that have access to sunlight. Well, the moon is a big place, might be pretty limited where we're trying to go. And that was the intent of the Artemis Accords, to prevent conflict before it occurs, to make sure that we're coordinating, to make sure that we proceed with values that give us a peaceful and prosperous future in space. And that's the answer to your question, David. The reason that government leaned forward with the Accords is we've got a choice as to what the future of space looks like. Is it going to be opaque? Is it going to be dangerous? Or is it going to be transparent? Is it going to be peaceful? Are we going to share information? So, for example, one of the important provisions of the Accords is the full, free, and open release of scientific data. And we hope that that sets, again, I'm a recovering attorney, so I'm going to use the word precedent, a precedent for not only the countries that have signed the Accords, but for even those who don't, that they practice this release of scientific information. So in terms of the race, I think it's not only a race between nations, but a race between values, a race between what the future is going to look like. And it's a race not only for the moon, but for the rest of the solar system, because as Pete said, the moon is an enabler for everything that comes afterwards. So this is a competition for what the future will look like, but there's also a singular opportunity for cooperation where we can come together to build that better future as well. I don't know which way it's going to go, but I think that America and the Artemis Accords family of nations need to lean into what kind of future we want, and that's what the Accords represent.
So that's
David, if I may, because I
Please.
think that's a good question, and I think there are two strategic stakes out here. One is that you will have a democratic open system. If you look at the Artemis Accord, which is non-binding, by the way, and that's why nations are happy to sign on to it. Whereas if you listen to the Global South, they want binding accords. So one is that this is either going to be a democratic, value-based, system, or on the other hand, you have a very authoritarian, closed system led by a one-party system. So if you look at the Chang'e mission, as well as China's overall context and narrative to want to become the leader, what is interesting to me is that, so you'll have these two systems. The second important stake is that if you look at strategic culture and how things have played out on Earth, and I've said this in my research, that being first is vital because of the fact that there is an assumption in Chinese strategic culture that if you are first, and if those areas have resources, you do have the entitlement to write the rules of the road. And if you look at the recent reorganization of the PLA Strategic Support Force, China Space Force, the new aerospace force that they have established, which is the Space Force for them, argues that it will also be involved in writing the rules of space governance. So that's what's at stake here when we think about the moon in the future.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it sort of leads into our next question that we have from the audience members, and it's something I wanted to talk about later or earlier, actually, given the nature of the CLIPS program at NASA, the emphasis, that sort of the heavy lean on the commercial sector to sort of pick up where the old Apollo missions might have left off years ago, and this pivot that really happened initially around the time of getting access. Well, frankly, getting access to the ISS, and then later in terms of cargo resupply to lunar surface and infrastructure development. But the question, I think, which is key, is the business case. What is the business case for the moon? And so this is the question. So people talk about the cislunar economy, and I would even venture to go further into the cislunar and specifically the lunar economy. But I've yet to hear anything about commercial activity that can produce a positive return on investment operating in the area or near the moon. And I think this is a foundational question in terms of national strategy, given the emphasis put on the CLIPS program. So I think I'll toss this over to you, Blaine, if you're willing to engage in it. If not, we can open it up to the broader group.
Sorry, could you just repeat just the last part of that question? I couldn't.
Sure. So it's the business case. Like, is there a viable potential for the development of a lunar and a cislunar economy that could ultimately provide the business case for the kind of lunar development on the commercial side that it seems that CLIPS is predicated?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit outside of the area that I would typically cover, but in general, it seems like if there's a real business case, it's probably pretty long term. A lot of it would be, at least in the near term, a lot of the activity is still, based around national missions or supporting those national missions, and I think that's where there may be a little bit of a fuzzy line between, let's say, business case and just national missions, or if as part of the Artemis Accords, part of the Gateway, or indeed possibly part of the ILRS, could be commercial companies furnishing different parts of the mission, and is that a business case for a commercial company? Probably yes. But in terms of like a really sustainable commercial economy, I think that's rather further off. Yeah.
It also plays into sort of a follow-up question, and I can kick this over to you, Pete. But the follow-up question is essentially, and we can touch on any additional sort of side tangents that we have here. But this is a question from Roderick Rule. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but will the extraction of oxygen from the hydrogen, the oxygen from the regolith on the lunar surface, is that not only it's technically feasible, but does it provide the kind of oomph that you might need to kickstart commercial development in a more profound way?
Yeah, maybe I could answer that, because I think I categorically disagree that there is not near term, and there's a couple of them. I mean, the fuel is a major asset. We have, for example, Elon Musk going to Mars. I mean, that's going to take an unbelievable amount of fuel to get there, and the best source of that, the moon, and he plans that to begin later this decade. Activities in cislunar require fuel, and I think the only legitimate source of fuel is probably the moon. I might add on CLIPS. In fact, my own foundation is beginning to fund a study to put a privately funded observatories on the far side of the moon. Scientific instruments are funded around the world, are a major part of commercial development, and so I think we sort of forget about science to our peril. That increasingly we're seeing both public and private money into that, and CLIPS is, most of its payloads now are scientific, and a lot of them are beginning to be paid for privately. So I think privately there's a lot of potential for cislunar space, starting with things on the lunar surface and fuel.
And if I may just cover my tracks a little bit, let's say, I think that the divergence in our answers is at least a little bit due to my being very much focused on the Chinese side of the equation, where if I could maybe ask Yao Song for his thoughts on this, but I think in China you have much more of in terms of the lunar type missions, it's still very much a state dominated part of the space sector, let's say, and for the commercial companies there's starting to be some limited but tangible opportunities in terms of space exploration more generally. So for example, last year we saw the first RFP for a commercial cargo spacecraft for the Chinese space station. But generally speaking, this kind of lunar stuff is still a national team mission type. And so I think it's interesting to hear Pete's perspective that in the West, let's say, that there's a lot more of commercial involvement, even in these things that are quite far off. And Yao, would you say that's a fair characterization, that for commercial companies, this is still not the most near-term focus in China?
This will be the last question you have, Song. So if you could just wrap this up really quickly. I know, Pete, you have to get going.
Yeah, so I think for recent 10 years, we do not consider, commercialize the moon exploration missions. Yeah, and I think it's mostly, I think, will be funded by the government. For now, I think for the supply spaceships to the space station is inviting tenders, in China. So it's widely inviting tenders, but for moon exploration, but maybe not in our 5-year plan for now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us in this much anticipated Space News Forum on the race to the moon. I have to personally thank you, Pete, and Mike, and Blaine, and Namrata, and Song for joining us all around the world on different time zones, and everybody who's in attendance. This has been an enlightening discussion. We're going to be doing more of these going forward. We will keep, I know some of us have to go, we'll keep this forum open for those who can stay for a couple more minutes. I know there's still questions coming in, but the official forum has since wrapped. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll hope to see you next time.